To everyone who's joined us so far, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for Time for Actions. I think it might be our 13th Time for Action webinar this spring. We've been at it every week. My name's Ken Johnson, and my colleagues Kathleen O'Hara, Rolly Montpellier, and I are coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. Also, we're in or near Ottawa. We're extremely pleased today to have two very knowledgeable guests that have just completed a comprehensive assessment, the only one I'm aware of the Liberal Climate Plan and associated documents, the Liberal Plan that was announced in December 2020. These two guys have done just an incredible, I've just been so impressed. They've done an incredible job. They did a really deep dive. They had to go to a number of documents and down all kinds of paths to find out what the Liberals were actually up to, because the actual plan is so unclear. So they're both members of SCAN, one of the newest NGOs. It stands for Seniors for Climate Action Now, and there's an exclamation mark. The first of the two fellows is David Robertson. He's retired. He was on the staff of the Canadian Auto Workers under now Unifor for over 25 years as a researcher and director of work, organizing and training. Prior to that, he was a researcher with the Ontario NDP at Queen's Park in Toronto. And earlier he was involved in setting up the university-based OPIRG, Ontario Public Interest Research Group. David has been a researcher, educator, and activist for a long time, and you'll see that he still is. Terry Moore is our other speaker today, and he got his research activist feet wet as a provincial coordinator with OPIRG as well, Ontario Public Interest Research Group, and as a member of the Ontario NDP Research Unit at Queen's Park in the late 1970s and early 80s. Following a 25-year career as staff representative with the Ontario Public Services Union, Terry has now returned to his environmental research activist roots with Environment Haliburton as host of the radio program Planet Haliburton. Okay, so David and Terry will now share their presentation, The Liberal Climate Action Formula, a Recipe for Failure. And I think the title is very appropriate, you'll see. And
well,
let's get at it. Over to you, David and Terry. Thanks very much for being here.
Great. Terry and I want to thank Ken, you and Kathleen and Rolly for the invitation to be here today. But more than that, SCAN, the Seniors for Climate Action Now, being a new climate action group, wants to thank you for all the tremendous work that you have done and continue to do. And we want to thank everyone who is joining with us today. It's interesting actually being at a session that sandwiched between the budget 2021 and the Biden summit. It kind of makes you a little unsure of the ground, but not exactly sure what happened in the budget, especially when it comes to the money. It's really hard to get a handle on the money. And we're not exactly sure what's going to happen in the Biden summit. But unfortunately, the budget doesn't change our analysis. And in fact, it reinforces it. The perspective that we have on the government's climate plan is reinforced by what we've seen in the budget. The budget has now stretched what was a problematic emission reduction target to one that is simply incredulous. The budget hunkers down on the government's commitment to a fossil first rather than a climate first action plan. And instead of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, the budget actually upped the ante with billions more for dirty hydrogen, for carbon storage, and for the big emitters. We're not going to spend a lot of time today on the budget. We're not reviewing the budget, but along the way, we will make a couple of observations. But our focus is on the healthy environment and the healthy economy, which the government has called its Strength and Climate Plan. On December 11th, 2020, the federal government released the plan. It's the report that sets in motion the programs, the initiatives, the funding that the federal government has chosen to reach Canada's huge greenhouse gas target for Paris 2030. It's the way that we are going to reduce our emissions from what they were in 2005 to what they should be in 2030. In fact, if we are going to reach Paris 2030, it's this plan that's going to make it all possible. So the Education Committee of SCAN, which Terry and I are both on, Seniors for Climate Action Now, decided if this is the plan that's going to get us to Paris 2030, then we better get a handle on it. We better understand what's involved. And so to do that, we started reading the Healthy Environment and a Healthy Economy report. And from now on, I think we'll just refer to that as the climate plan. We then realized that we had to review all of the modeling appendices that were part of the plan, but not in the plan. And once we did that, we realized that we had to now review a whole series of related policy initiatives, strategy documents, and follow-up announcements. And that's because the climate plan is at the center of a constellation of policy initiatives. Soon after it was released, the government launched its hydrogen strategy for Canada. So at one level, I'm going to switch the slide there, Terry. At one level, the climate plan is a smorgasbord of climate initiatives. You know, at face value, a fairly impressive checklist. At first blush, it's incredibly promising. There are programs to help homeowners and car drivers shift away from fossil fuels. There's an accelerating price on carbon. There's a commitment to protect and restore ecosystems. There are promises of more support for Indigenous communities and Indigenous climate initiatives. But the plan is more than a checklist of 64 initiatives. The plan actually puts in place what you could call the building blocks that are used to construct the government's approach to climate action. And that approach is worrying. I'm going to start this slide at the bottom left and then move to the right. It's clear from reading the plan that the government is responding to climate change. It is not responding to a climate emergency. In fact, nowhere in the plan itself is there a reference to a climate crisis or a climate emergency. Interestingly enough, in the budget the other day, there was one or two mentions of the word climate crisis, and then they were quickly pushed aside to get back to the talking about the less urgent sense of climate change. Secondly, the plan commits to the same old model of economic growth, albeit this time in a greenwash. Economic growth is the goal of the climate plan. Third, there is an unwavering belief that market players responding to price signals will solve the problem of the climate. Fourth, moving up to the next tier on the chart in front of you, there is the same unwavering belief, actually, that technological innovations will solve the problem. Fifth, through all of this, there is the strong commitment to protect the interests of the oil and gas industry in Canada. And finally, there is a sense throughout the plan that Canada will emerge in this era as a vibrant, low-carbon export economy. A number of years ago, people will remember that Stephen Harper boasted that Canada was an energy superpower. Now Trudeau is making a similar bid, but this time it's as a hydrogen superpower. So today's discussion is going to be framed around four conclusions that we came to. We have no confidence in the climate plan. First, because we're convinced it will not deliver our Paris targets. Second, the plan contains a seriously flawed carbon pricing system, and we'll say a bit about that. The plan suffers from some glaring and alarming omissions, and the plan commits to developing and selling fossil fuel hydrogen in the name of climate action. And in the process, it transfers a lot of money to the private sector, money that was enlarged upon in the budget the other day.
One way to assess the climate plan is to look at some specific climate initiatives that are contained in it. Our review suggests that individually and taken together, they are too little, too late. Not enough soon enough and not enough money, poorly conceived and designed and implemented in many cases, not ambitious enough, and there's no direct link between the programs and expected emission reductions. A very few quick examples will illustrate our concerns. The government's climate promise is pretty clear. This is what they say. The proposed actions outlined in this plan will enable Canada to exceed its current 2030 target. Recall that the Paris target is to reduce emission levels by 30% by 2030 compared to 2005. Budget 2021 increases Canada's emission reduction target from 30% below 2005 by 2030 to 36%. We'll see tomorrow if the Biden Climate Summit provides a platform for any additional announcements. It's important to realize that these targets represent a much less ambitious goal than keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. An example of not enough soon enough is the problem with the home retrofit program. When it ends in 2028, this program will have provided a very modest level of assistance to retrofitting only 1 in 10 houses. What we need instead is a deep and extensive retrofit program. Budget 2021 appropriates the, quote, deep retrofit, unquote, handle, but leaves the heavy lifting up to the $40,000 per household interest-free loan program. Post-COVID, who can afford to take on this level of additional personal debt? With respect to poor design and implementation, the $2 billion tree program was announced in the last election and then repeated in the climate plan, but not one of those trees has yet been planted. The program completely ignores the fact that for the last 15 years, Canada's forests have not been carbon sinks. They are net carbon sources, and the government knows this. Planting another 200 million trees a year won't change that reality. But there's no mention of this program at all in budget 2021. As an example of not ambitious enough, a number of years ago, the government announced an aspirational goal of eliminating internal combustion cars by 2040. This was what's called a soft target. Many countries and regions have proposed hard targets with deadlines to ban internal combustion engines. The climate plan maintains zero emission vehicle subsidy and provides money for electric buses, but it doesn't turn soft targets into hard targets. In fact, it doesn't even mention targets at all. One of the key reasons why we don't think the climate plan can achieve Canada's Paris targets is that there are no links between specific climate programs and expected carbon outcomes. A key lesson from past failures to achieve targets is that if you don't build systems in to transparently measure and track program progress and outcomes, you can't manage them credibly or successfully.
Earlier, we just said that to reach Paris, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% from the base year 2005. The budget just changed that a bit, and we'll come back to that in a bit. I want to start and stay with that original target, though. Here's what we know about the size of the reduction that's necessary. In 2005, our greenhouse gas emissions were 730 megatons. By 2030, they have to be reduced to 511 megatons. The difference is 219 megatons. That is a huge reduction. To give it some context, it is more than all of the oil and gas emissions that were discharged into the atmosphere in 2005. It is more than all of the heavy industry emissions combined with all of the emissions from buildings in 2005. That volume of reduction is a really big task. But in addition to the volume of change, there is also the rate of change. When you compare the required future cuts to our past record, here's what you see. In the 13 years between 2005 and 2018, Canada reduced our emissions by only 14 megatons, about 1 megaton a year. Now, looking forward in the 12 years between 2018 and 2030, we need to reduce the emissions by over 200 megatons, an average of 17 megatons a year. That's an increase of over 1,400%. The numbers in this chart come from the modeling appendix of the climate plan. In the left column, what you see are the broadly defined sectors, such as oil and gas, transportation, buildings, and so on. In the right column are the emission reductions the government expects to achieve between 2005 and 2030. We're not going to spend time going through all of that, but we do want to look at a couple of numbers. The largest reductions that are anticipated to occur by 2030 are in the electricity sector, which will account for 108 megatons. And the category near the bottom you'll see is land use and forestry, which will be responsible for a 27 megaton reduction. Just look at those numbers compared to the others on the chart. These two categories account for more than half of all of the emission reductions we are going to achieve by 2030. The first one, electricity emissions at 108 megatons, by itself is almost half of what is anticipated to be achieved. And the majority of those reductions are the result of phasing out coal-fired electricity plants. And that really does speak to the importance of phasing out fossil fuel. The second largest category comes from a category called LULUCF, which stands for land use change, and forestry. And this is where things get a little more complicated. When you look at the numbers from land use change, and forestry, you see that it's responsible for 27 megatons of emission reductions. That's the second highest reduction in the entire economy. But this isn't a sector like other sectors. It's not like buildings or transport or like heavy industry or oil and gas. In fact, it is a construct that didn't even exist in 2005, which is now our base year. The government refers to the LULUCF numbers as an accounting contribution, where all the other numbers are either calculations or estimates or forecasts. The LULUCF numbers are much more fragile. In fact, much of the land use and forestry sector contribution is based on our forests sequestering an ever-increasing amount of carbon. So we have this problem. On the one hand, the government acknowledges that Canada's managed forests are actually net carbon sources, not carbon sinks, but the Liberal climate plan seems to discount forestry emissions, turns them into withdrawals, and credits that can be used to actually make the numbers add up to Paris 2030. This next slide is a bit heavy on numbers, but just let me walk through it briefly. In 2005, all our emissions from all real sectors were 730 megatons. In 2030, that has to be reduced to 531. No, sorry. In 2030, all of the emissions from all real sectors is 531 megatons. The emissions that we need to get to, according to the Paris targets, are 511. In other words, we overshoot the target. We're not going to achieve the target. We're going to miss Paris by 20 megatons. When you add the LULUCF contributions, all of a sudden the arithmetic changes. The LULUCF is responsible for 27 megatons with emission reductions. So now you've got emissions from all sectors at 531. You subtract from that the emissions from the forestry contribution at 27, and all of a sudden, Canada meets the Paris 2030 targets. In fact, according to the modeling, we're better than the Paris 2030 targets. It's a problem, however, when our plan to achieve Paris 2030 is so overwhelmingly reliant on this construct of land use change, and forestry. And when you stack that up against our past record, Canada has failed to meet all 9 previous emission reduction targets. Our conclusion is that we're on the way to fail to meet the 10th one. So the big news in the budget when it comes to climate action is the government's new target for 2030. Canada is obligated to up its game and to set more ambitious, what's called nationally determined commitments by the time COP26 rolls around in the fall of this year. The government's new target now, as Terry mentioned earlier, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 36% over 2005. This would be a lot better news if it had any supporting evidence in the budget. Instead, the chart that you see in front of you now just appears like magic on page 172 of the budget, and it has this note that accompanies it. It says, 2030 trajectory after budget 2021 measures and additional actions, including continued alignment with the US. In other words, you can't find the actions that are going to get us here in the budget or the climate plan, or for that matter, anywhere else that we've seen yet. The new budget target of 36% emission reductions is monumental. It amounts to the elimination of an additional 43 megatons of emissions. If you, again, for context, that's more than twice the projected reductions in the entire oil and gas sector by 2030. It is more than 4 times the emission reductions that we will achieve from buildings by 2030. It is almost twice as much as the achievements from heavy industry by 2030. Given Canada's track record, the challenge is monumental. In fact, the recently released National Inventory of Emissions, which is now using data for 2019, updated from 2018, shows that our emissions are still climbing. They're not going down. They're still climbing. There is nothing in the budget that is new or different or enriched or enlarged enough to suggest that those new targets are at all achievable.
One of the reasons we think we're unlikely to reach Paris targets is the inadequacy of specific climate action programs. But the major reason is because the government prefers a passive and indirect approach that relies on market signals, incentives, and a whole lot of flexibility when it comes to major greenhouse gas emitters. Climate pricing is a central plank in the government's climate plan. Their pricing system has 2 parts. The first part is a charge on fossil fuel called the fuel charge, used to power vehicles, run appliances and machines, heat buildings, and so on. A cap and trade system for large industry known as the output-based pricing system, or OBPS, is the other part. The carbon price will increase by $15 a ton per year from 2022 to 2030, when it will reach $170 a ton, or about 40 cents a liter at the gas pump. People are generally familiar with the fuel charge part of the system, but less familiar with part 2. In Canada, 1,700 emitters are responsible for about 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions. 17 large emitters cause about 78 million tons of emissions. That's an amount greater than all emissions from Canada's agricultural sector, or about 90% of the emissions from all buildings in the country. To deal with emissions from big emitters, the government has designed the output-based pricing system. Instead of hard caps and tightening emission standards, the OPPS sets a price on emissions above a specified level, but then provides a number of ways for companies to avoid reducing emissions and avoid paying the costs at the same time. There are a number of problems with the OBPS. Companies are free to pollute up to a certain specified level. Compare that to the principle of the fuel charge, where every liter of gas you use at the pump is subject to the carbon surcharge. Above that level, they can continue to emit greenhouse gases as long as they reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of production. The government makes a distinction between absolute emission levels and levels based on the carbon intensity of production. This is called the intensity rule. An example probably is very useful to make the difference clear. Cenovus is a large oil and natural gas company headquartered in Calgary. Here's a recent quote from the company. Quote, Cenovus is targeting to reduce its per barrel greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by the end of 2030, using a 2019 baseline, and hold its absolute emissions flat by the end of 2030. The new 2030 greenhouse gas emission targets are among the most ambitious in the world for an upstream exploration and production company. So it's not going to reduce its absolute emissions by 2030. It will, however, reduce its per barrel emissions. The atmosphere cares about absolute emissions, not emission intensity. The worst thing about this quote is the boast at the end and its potential for actually being true. That was that the new 2030 greenhouse gas emission targets are among the most ambitious in the world for an upstream exploration and production company. Let's go back to the problems. If companies reduce the intensity of carbon in a unit of production, they get credits would allow them to pollute more later, or sell them to other companies who can use them as they can continue to pollute. This is how the government describes their system. Quote, the amount each facility pays depends on how much carbon pollution it emits to put out 1 unit of product. If a facility finds a way to pollute less per unit, it will save money or earn credits. In addition to all of the above, the government has announced a new offset market, which will allow large emitters to pollute more by investing in carbon offsets elsewhere, for example, in forest regeneration projects. If there's any money raised by the output-based pricing system, it will be returned to industry through various programs. In addition, the climate plan announced that massive amounts of money will be given to industry regardless of any emission revenues. And now, as of budget 2021, that amount of money stands at $8 billion. In the end, we think the output-based pricing system is an expensive, overly complicated system that will encourage companies to find ways to avoid paying emission liabilities rather than reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's simply too much room to game the system. And the system the government has designed will force others to pick up the emission shortfalls and pay that bill.
Most governments, many international agencies, long lists of climate experts all point to the need for dramatic increases in renewable energy. Report after report points to the critical importance of solar and wind power. In fact, it's hard to imagine any climate action plan that doesn't make a strong commitment to renewable energy, but that is precisely the case with the government's new and improved climate plan. There isn't a mention of solar and wind. There's 2 things we know about renewables in Canada. First, they don't count for much. And second, after some initial growth, they are now faltering. This chart shows the composition of the renewable energy portion of Canada's energy supply. As a reference point, renewable energy amounts to about 17% of our total energy. The rest is based on fossil fuels. But of the portion that is renewable, about 68% is hydroelectric, 23% is solid biomass, 5.2% is wind, 1.8% is ethanol, 0.8% is municipal waste and landfill gas, and solar photovoltaic is 0.1%. Canada gets more energy from landfill gas than we do from photovoltaic solar. Solar and wind have become less expensive and more efficient year after year. They are now one of the least expensive energy sources, much less than nuclear, much less than hydrogen. But despite this competitive advantage in price terms, the annual additions to renewable energy generating capacity have fallen considerably. So here's the contradiction. Even though costs are down, investment has tanked. The Liberal climate plan doesn't address any of these issues. It doesn't even acknowledge any of these issues. There is no section of the report that is devoted to developments in wind and solar power capacity. There is no commentary about the role wind and solar can play in the shift to electrification of our overall energy system. There are no new funding programs to support such a transition. There are no targets for expansion of clean, renewable energy. Renewable solar power and wind energy stand as one of the most glaring omissions in the Healthy Environment and the Healthy Economy report. We had hoped that the 2021 budget would change that, but it didn't. There are no new programs in the 2021 budget for solar or wind power. Instead of renewables, the federal government has bought the hydrogen hype, the nuclear promise, and the techno fix of carbon storage.
Another key omission from the plan has to do with accountability for achieving targets. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change points to the need for carbon budgets as a necessary link between temperature outcomes and greenhouse gas emissions. A global carbon budget is the cumulative amount of carbon pollution that can be dumped into the atmosphere without pushing global average temperatures past identified limits, such as 1.5 degrees Celsius. National carbon budgets focus on countries taking their fair share of the global greenhouse gas emission reductions required to keep temperature increases below that number. Carbon budgets are the best way to make governments accountable, but the Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act tabled by the federal government last fall ignores them. The climate budget omits any mention, the climate plan omits any mention of carbon budgets at all. A carbon budget for Canada based on doing our fair share to keep global temperature increases below 1.5 C would require keeping most of the country's oil and gas reserves in the ground. Let's summarize what we've discussed and seen so far. The specific programs and initiatives in the climate plan, such as home retrofits, tree planting, and zero emission vehicles won't get us to Paris. The carbon pricing system, and especially the OBPS portion of it, is seriously flawed and won't get us to Paris. The climate plan suffers from glaring omissions, and those omissions will make it very difficult for the country to reach its Paris targets. The federal government claims that its climate plan achieves both our environmental goals and our economic hopes. But the economic considerations trump the climate crisis. We don't want to estimate the need for economic and social transformation. The climate emergency demands it. The issue is what economic model it will be under and which such transformation will occur.
So it's taken us a bit of time to get here, but this is the heart of the Liberal government's climate action plan. It can best be described as both a climate and an economic formula, with the economic trumping the climate. It goes like this: carbon pricing plus hydrogen plus carbon storage, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage, plus nuclear equals Paris 2030 and beyond. Behind this equation is arrayed a pretty powerful set of forces: big oil and gas companies, the hydrogen lobby, the nuclear industry, the carbon storage companies, the big emitters, and a number of different provinces. So we've already talked a little bit about carbon pricing. In the time remaining, we'll talk on the next two elements of the equation, hydrogen and carbon storage. And given our time today, we're not going to be able to say much about nuclear. A few days after the release of the climate plan, the government launched the hydrogen strategy for Canada. They need to be read in tandem. The hydrogen strategy is twice as long as the climate plan, in part because it is the climate plan. It's hard to overstate the role of hydrogen in the government plan. Here it is in their own words. And it's a quote that comes from the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy report. Hydrogen is one of Canada's most exciting economic transformation opportunities. It will enable a new Canadian competitive advantage in a low carbon economy. It will position Canada to become a world-leading supplier of hydrogen and hydrogen technologies. It will generate economic opportunities through exports and direct foreign investment. This is the government's climate and economic plan. These two additional quotes, which come from the hydrogen strategy, serve to reinforce the point. The hydrogen strategy is an ambitious framework that seeks to position Canada as a global hydrogen leader. The strategy will utilize Canadian expertise to build new hydrogen supply that will power our country's clean energy future. In a remarkably short time, the hydrogen lobby has achieved the political, the financial, the regulatory support to launch a multi-decade hydrogen program. According to the strategy, hydrogen is going to play an integral role in Canada's future energy mix. In fact, by 2050, up to 30% of Canada's end-use energy will be hydrogen, according to the plan. Keep in mind that renewable, all renewable, from hydro and biomass to solar and wind, are only 17% now. You'll get a sense of how big a reach that is. In fact, we finally saw an ambitious climate target, the first one we've heard from the Liberals. Unfortunately, it's the wrong one. 30% by 2050 is a problem. It's quite amazing what hydrogen is going to do for us. Take a look at this slide. This comes in various ways from the report. Hydrogen is going to transform flagging sectors into thriving industries. It's going to drive innovation and investment all across the economy. It's going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. They use the figure 350,000. It's going to generate economic opportunities all across the country. It's going to provide opportunities for Indigenous communities. It's going to harness the skill and the technical expertise of a generation. It's going to fuel economic growth. It's going to revitalize Canada as a major energy exporter. It's going to be the path to net zero by 2050. In short, the list is long and exhausting. That's the hype. The reality, I think, is a bit different. Hydrogen has a benevolent, clean energy image, but there are different types of hydrogen. In fact, hydrogen is color-coded. There is green hydrogen, there's gray hydrogen, and there's blue hydrogen. And the colors have to do with how hydrogen is made. There are basically two ways to make hydrogen. Green hydrogen, which is the good hydrogen, is produced through electrolysis using renewable energy to convert water into hydrogen. Gray hydrogen uses natural gas as the feedstock to fuel a process called steam reforming, which breaks down methane into hydrogen and carbon dioxide. This is dirty hydrogen. The gray hydrogen becomes blue hydrogen when the carbon released during the production process is captured and stored somewhere underground forever. Once that happens, blue hydrogen is gray hydrogen that has been greenwashed. It's quite amazing to see the alchemy of turning a carbon-intensive fossil fuel like natural gas into a clean energy source, but that is Canada's hydrogen strategy. Canada has fully committed to a fossil hydrogen future. This quote makes the point. Canadian marketable resources of natural gas can sustain current production levels for up to 300 years. Hydrogen production from natural gas offers a unique opportunity to leverage Canada's vast gas reserves. Canada's Climate Action Plan is about throwing a lifeline or another lifeline to the fossil fuel industry. As the strategy notes, quote, natural gas will have declining demand if it's not used to produce hydrogen. On the other hand, if hydrogen comprises 30% of the energy by 2050, as the plan is predicting, and if all of that hydrogen is from natural gas, which may be a bit of a reach, it will require huge increases in natural gas demand and production. The figures used by the hydrogen strategy are in front of you. 178% increase in natural gas demand and a 62% increase in production. It will also require a major push to promote carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There's a number of problems with hydrogen. First of all, it's not an energy source, it's an energy carrier. Hydrogen is made by using energy that is better used directly. For instance, like green energy is the right kind, but the wrong choice. It takes renewable energy to make green hydrogen. So why use hydrogen when you can just use renewable energy directly? Wouldn't that make more sense? That becomes the issue. Blue hydrogen, on the other hand, sets up a very expensive and complicated system to make natural gas a low carbon fossil fuel. And then to export that fossil fuel, which is the government's plan, means we have to clean it, and then we have to store all the leftover carbon here underground forever. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is a technological gamble, and it's going to require massive amounts of public money to get there. And even with that, the government's on side. Carbon storage has the full commitment from the government. In its climate plan, it has promised to develop a comprehensive strategy. It has promised to invest in large-scale industrial projects. It's not possible to support fossil fuel hydrogen without also supporting carbon storage systems, however problematic. And carbon storage systems are problematic. They are extremely expensive. The private sector doesn't want to pay for them. And it is still an unreliable technological solution.
With Canada's hydrogen strategy, we are moving fast in the wrong direction. Just how fast is illustrated by a couple of key elements in the 2021 budget, which creates a new CCUS investment tax credit to support hydrogen production, confirms the creation of a $1.5 billion over 5-year clean fuels fund to, quote, position Canada as a global hydrogen leader and deliver on the hydrogen strategy for Canada. In addition, it commits $319 million over 7 years for CCUS research and development. Rather than eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, the Liberals are creating new ones. In the end, we think that our climate choices are stark and clear. We started this presentation by quoting Justin Trudeau's fossil first declaration back in 2017. No country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and leave them there. That fossil first perspective leads directly to the Liberal climate formula. Carbon pricing plus hydrogen plus carbon capture plus nuclear equals Paris 2030 and beyond. We think the Liberal fossil first climate plan will lead us to climate disaster. The 2018 IPCC special 1.5C report was absolutely clear about what is needed. Rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban and infrastructure, including transportation and buildings, and industrial systems. System transitions that are unprecedented in terms of scale, requiring deep emission reductions in all sectors. Embracing this climate first call to action would mean adopting a climate first formula that would read something like this: fossil fuel phase out plus hard caps plus clean renewables plus electrification equals Paris 2030 and system change. The climate justice movement has been mobilizing around some form of climate first plan. The question is, can we mobilize enough people to reject fossil fuel choices for Canada in time to pull us back from the brink of climate chaos? And the stakes could not be higher. On February 26th of this year, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, released the latest report on national climate goals the countries of the world are committed to by the end of 2020, emphasizing that they are, quote, nowhere close to achieving the 1.5 degree Paris target. He characterized this as a red alert for the planet. Young climate activists mobilizing with their allies all over the world are right. It's time to tell the truth. It's time for emergency climate action at the scale of the climate emergency we're facing. It's time to end fossil first and put climate first and people first. So that's it for us. We want to thank you for taking your time and your patience for going through this presentation. And we look forward to the comment and question section to follow.
Thank you, David and Terry, for an incredible presentation and remarkable amount of work you guys have done. I've just not seen anything like this from any other groups in terms of their assessment. And I'd like to apologize. Zoom has just caused me incredible trouble. Suddenly my speakers don't work on my computer just when I need them. And so then I'm talking about my cell phone going, I've got two screens going. That's why it was messed up at the beginning. I apologize to everyone for that. First thing I'd like to ask you about is a little more, Terry and David, about the carbon budget, because they've said, the IPCC has said we need to reduce our carbon by 7.6% per year, every year between now and 2030. And yet in this plan, they don't even talk about carbon budgets. There's no time frames. It's just sort of this whimsical, well, we've modeled it and we're sure we're going to get there. But a lot of these things, even the development of the carbon capture, it's not at a place where it's economically viable or on scale at all. And yet somehow we're going to reduce our emissions. I wonder if you want to talk more about that budget, carbon budget problem.
Maybe I'll just start that off, David. We happen to think that carbon budgets are really, really important because they make all of the announcements, or at least in a proper form. What they do is they put all of government pronouncements and really well-sounding and really encouraging messaging into the context, well, okay, what's that going to translate into absolute emission reductions? And how does that relate to where we have to go in order to protect the climate and future generations and all life on the planet? That's what we mean by putting the climate first, is that we're dealing with with an immensely complicated climate system, but we really do know a lot about the limits we have to place on emissions in order to keep temperature increases below 1.5 C, which is also a level, by the way, which is already going to be incredibly damaging for large portions of humanity on the planet, and it's going to be very dangerous for many living things and for a significant length of time. But if we don't put all of our announcements with respect to the expected emission reductions into some kind of a budget that translates what we're doing into what we have to do and compare it to what we have to do in order to protect the climate, then everybody's operating in a vacuum. And all we're faced with is a never-ending list, a never-ending checklist. As a matter of fact, how it feels to us when you take a look at the budget, there's dozens and dozens of announcements, none of which are specifically, costed in terms of their carbon reduction potential. And under the Accountability Act that the Liberals have tabled, there's no actual accounting that's going to take place until 2029, a year before we have to have reduced emissions, as you pointed out, by 7.6% in the meantime, by at least 45% over 2010 levels by 2030. So carbon budgeting is absolutely essential and necessary to focus the politics around climate change on what the targets mean and hold governments accountable for achieving them.
David, do you want to say, thank you. Terry, do you want to say anything?
No, I think that covered it.
You said in the presentation you didn't have time to talk about the small nuclear reactors, but I think it also is a very important piece of the puzzle. So I'd appreciate it, maybe David, if you just gave us a couple of points on that. I know you've dealt with it in your report.
Yeah, it's one of those, for me anyway, I don't know why I keep getting astounded or whatever, but when I read it, it's like, it's amazing hype. There is a nuclear strategy. There's two documents. We have a nuclear strategy and we have an action plan to realize the nuclear strategy. And it's all about small modular reactors. And the notion of a small modular reactor is you can build it in a factory, put it on a truck, and set it up in any location that you want. It's not like our big nuclear plants of today. The problem again is when you read the report, you're just caught by your BS detector start going, bzz, 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 that you say, like, where's the evidence here? Where's the proof? You start looking for the footnotes, you start looking for the background information. But what's amazing in my mind is how something can so quickly go from hype to actual policy in such a short period of time. And small scale nuclear reactors did that. There are 4 provinces already now signed on to it. We don't have small scale nuclear reactors. They're still at the demonstration stage. There's still talk about what actually the fuel looks like. The strategy admits the problem of nuclear waste is still there. It is still unresolved. The action plan says, the small nuclear folks say, well, we want some government support so that we're not incurring those costs. In fact, if you read the strategy, it's all about public support. Everything about the small nuclear reactor. I mean, they want the government to cost share, loan guarantees, contracts that are guaranteed. They want the public to do it all so they can develop this technology, which no one knows yet if it's going to be safe, effective, or useful. And again, the question isn't, you know, and some people may say, well, it does have potential. It would have a potential for a remote location that is now using big diesel generators that could use a small nuclear and get us off fossil fuel. I mean, there may be some opportunities for that. I don't know. But when things are about a choice, do you invest in solar and wind? Do you invest in the electrification of the grid? Do you help homeowners, you know, install heat pumps? Or do you give public subsidies to small scale nuclear reactors? I know where my choice would be.
Thank you, David. Just adding on to that, I know Bill Gates is all over the small nuclear and he's got a bunch of his rich buddies to invest as well. But the strategy is not that Bill will take the, you know, pay for it all. He'll just invest some and then they'll press the government to put in a fortune. I was wondering if you've seen any numbers on, and all 3 of these, I mean, we need to be reducing this decade. The IPCC is completely clear on that, as you would know. But carbon capture is not realistic this decade. Small nuclear is not realistic this decade. Hydrogen in a scale is not realistic this decade. And yet they're talking about those being the key drivers of reducing. There's no way it's going to happen by 2030. Just terribly problematic. And of course, then you don't put any carbon budgets or you have no 2025 carbon target, also a problem. I'd like to just ask maybe one more question. In terms of, you did mention the federal budget. I'm going to try and share a slide that came out of the budget. And I was wondering maybe you could comment on it if I can get it up here. The luck I've been having, I mean, oh, there we go. Can you see that?
Not yet.
I don't see a slide.
Okay, I'm just going to ask because it's coming up on my other screen. The federal budget for climate, they said $5 billion over 7 years to net zero accelerator.
This is amazing. That I'll start and let Terry follow up. In the Healthy Environment and the Healthy Economy report, one of the points that I was encouraged by is the government committed to end inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. I was struck by the fact that, first of all, for the first time, it admitted that any of them were inefficient. You know, I thought, oh, now they're inefficient. They used to be just, you know, the cat's meow before, but it said it will eliminate them. So I expected to see that in the budget. And instead, what you have is this zero acceleration fund. It was first announced at $5 billion. The budget ups it to $8 billion. So we are giving big emitters, hydrogen producers, CCUS companies, $8 billion to help clean up their act. And I would, okay, if we had a system that said there are hard caps in place, companies are going to reduce their emissions every year, and we're going to provide some public support to help them do that, I don't think, given the crisis, I would have a problem with that. But what we have in Canada is 2 wrongs. The first wrong is the whole carbon pricing system for big emitters lets them off the hook. And secondly, we give them $8 billion. You know, just what a system.
Yes.
I think I'll just leave it at that. I think David's comment is just fine where it is.
Okay, thank you. The next one was 50% tax cut for manufacturers of net zero technologies.
Okay, I mean, again, then I said, okay, this is interesting. Net zero technologies are important. We have to have more of them. We have to try and commercialize, get from demonstration to full-fledged production. What struck me about that was not the fact, like tax, I mean, reducing taxes by 50% is there's some serious issues about that in terms of social justice and equity and our tax system. But you say, okay, is this an impetus to develop clean zero emission technologies? And then you look at the number, it's 45 million over 5 years. That means it's 10 million a year. So as soon as I saw 10 million a year stacked up against all this other huge numbers the government has out there, I realized this isn't serious. This is just, oh, we better check this box off because it'll make us look good. Nothing,
Yeah,
for 10 million a year, what's going to happen?
This is a public relations exercise. This is, like as David said, this is another tick on their list of initiatives which they think will appeal to particular political constituencies. This is not a serious climate policy. If you were serious about climate, by the way, I don't think what you'd be doing is leading with things like tax cuts and incentives and so on and so forth. You'd be putting hard caps in place. You'd be putting targets for reducing our fossil fuel production. That is, you deal with the supply side, and you put some hard and fast regulations that are designed to achieve a particular temperature outcome, a climate first approach in place, and you would then have the carbon budgets to help get us there, not just incentives that, that may or may not work and are so puny as to be insignificant.
Thank you. I just want to do one other thing. We're going to go to about 2:15 because the speakers can stay, and obviously they could probably talk to us for about the next 20 hours nonstop as a tag team. So, but I just want to make one point is, of course, with solar having dropped 85% in the last decade and probably going to drop another 75% this decade, not quite as extreme reductions in wind, but it started cheaper, and also battery technology going down fast. One of my worries is if these other technologies work, they're going to be so expensive that our electricity will simply not be competitive. For example, when they're fixing up the nuclear plants in Ontario, they're looking for 17 or 18 cents a kilowatt hour, and solar and wind are down around 5 or less, and it's going to get cheaper. And so we're just going to become incredibly uncompetitive even if we get there. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. The last thing I wanted to say was I wondered if you'd seen the article by Martin Lukács just in the last day in The Breach, the new journal The Breach, where he talks about the fact that a secret committee was formed with the CEOs of the major oil and gas firms and some of the main cabinet ministers, natural resources, climate, and I can't remember the other one, that just came out by access to information. So they've been, it helps you understand what's going on here. They've been meeting for the last year talking about the best way forward. And they also have, oil and gas has met with the federal government something like 1,200 times officially in the last year. Now, we can't get anything like that kind of access, no matter how hard we try. Anyway, any comment on that? And then I'll throw it over to Rolly if you want, for questions.
Well, other than to acknowledge that the federal Liberal government has been captured by the fossil fuel industry. And I don't know how we break those links, but we have to think about how we do that. Recently there was a document put out by the UN Environmental Committee that's called the production gap. And it's talking about basically how you phase out oil and gas in various countries and what they're doing in terms of commitments to phase out oil and gas and their subsidies to oil and gas and all the like. And what struck me partially about that report was they put countries in tiers, like, not dependent to fully dependent on oil and gas. And we didn't figure into the fully dependent on oil and gas because we get so little revenue from it. So here we are, we don't meet the definition of dependence, which means we get something for it, but we are totally captured as a country to this notion of, you know, now with Trudeau, it's the hydrogen superpower status, you know, a global powerhouse in hydrogen.
I think that is a really important point. And I think that Martin Lukash, who wrote that article in The Breach, he also wrote a book called The Trudeau Formula. And it's about Trudeau marketing himself to the ruling class in this country, put it crassly, with respect to why he was running for the leader of the Liberal Party and why they should support him. By the way, his pitch was, I can get you the pipelines. I'm your guy. Stephen Harper couldn't get you the pipelines, but I can. And here's how I'm going to do it. But I'm going to need a little help from my friends in the room. So, I mean, we took, in some sense, that was quite influential with us in the Trudeau formula for obtaining power by currying favor with fossil capital, big time. You know, it was a very influential in terms of how we thought of, well, what is Trudeau's formula? Well, he's in power. You know, he pitched himself. Now let's just see what he's doing in power. What strikes me is that in this country, renewables have been left to the private sector, and with declining levels of prices, you know, on the cost side, there's a number of studies which have pointed to the fact that there's a real contradiction here. Prices are going down for renewables, but in fact, investment is not picking up, or the actual capacity is not being built to displace fossil fuels, which is really what's happening. And if we leave it to the private sector to do it by providing a whole series of incentives, tax cuts, and so on and so forth, build funds and give away public money, the question is that why don't we just do it directly? Why don't we do it through the public sector, like we built public power on the hydro side, right? And build renewables through the public sector. I think that that's a question which we're all going to have to address very clearly about how we're going to get anywhere close to our Paris targets and beyond.
Well, it's all pieces of the puzzle. Time for Action, we're trying to capture those pieces of the puzzle. So we're going to have Martin Lukacs on in 2 weeks specifically because of his book, The Trudeau Formula. We had Donald Gutstein on talking about the big stall, which looks at basically the legacy of the last 50 years of the oil and gas industry managing to infiltrate everywhere to block action on climate change. And then we had, we've had several that relate to exactly what you're talking about. I'd like to turn it over now to, thank you very much, David and Terry. I'd like to turn it over to Rolly for some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Ken. Yes, a lot of interesting comments. First of all, in the chat, I could hardly keep up, but one of them that really caught my eye when you were talking about carbon and it gives new meaning to carbon capture. Now, I think this person, Chris Roberts, was using that as like, we've been captured.
We've been captured. That's a good line.
Yeah. So thank you, Chris Roberts. I'm going to use that with your permission at some point when I write. Yes. Now, there are a lot of questions. I will certainly not get through all of them, but one of them has to do with, there are a lot of questions about whether this recording will be available, and the answer is yes. We always send an email, post presentation to the participants. It will include a link to the video. And some have asked also if there will be a link to the slide presentation, which is in the video. So we will be asking the presenters if they wish to share the slide deck, but that will be, of course, with their permission, and I can see some nods already. So we will, we've been granted permission to include the slide deck as well, because a lot of great slides which can be used in social media, again, all with your permission. So that was a question from Evelyn Gigantes in Ottawa, and others have asked the same question. Now, the first question.
Only, can I just say, sorry, just on the PowerPoint also, there are notes available that we will make sure is included in the PowerPoint, so that the commentary is there. And also the study that this is based on is up on the Seniors for Climate Action Now website, and people can download the whole study and get much more detail than we could cover today.
Fantastic. I will certainly be looking. In fact, I've already looked at the study, and I'm sure that a lot of participants today will want to do the same thing. Rose Dyson asks, and I'm just reading from the note that I've taken, how can we make better use of the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty?
Yeah.
Also, how effective are ESGs, ethical and financial sector? Will the sale of green bonds help in transforming the economy? So that's kind of a multifaceted question. Did you want to tackle that?
Well,
David first, and maybe
No,
Terry?
it sounds like that one should be handled by Terry.
Well, just on.
I'm just joking, but
Okay, all at once, or can I break it
go
down into
ahead.
chunks?
Go ahead. Yeah, chunk.
Just on that social investment side or ethical investment side, I think that or the green, or maybe the green bonds. First off, I think it depends entirely on what the money is used for. If I thought they were raising money for public investments in public control and development of renewables, as opposed to providing incentives to the private sector, then I would be much more favorable to this. But I think it depends entirely on what the money is going to be used for. I'm really glad to see that they're going to be using it. They're not raising it through through the private sector. It looks like they're going to be doing it through public sector bond issues. But what are they going to use the money for? That's the key question. And like on the issue with respect to ESG, I'm not a big fan of a lot of companies by themselves going in the direction of helping the country get well beyond the net zero rhetoric and get to real zero, but in a time that requires to actually take a step back from climate chaos. And it usually involves companies paying a lot of lip service, to energy policies. Sometimes they mean it, but oftentimes it's just simply a camouflage, a kind of a greenwashing to attract investors. And I think that it's not going to be a primary mover in getting us from where we are to where we need to go. That the scale has got to be just simply dramatically orders of magnitude higher than that can be accomplished, in that route.
Okay,
Let me just take a little different
Sure.
twist on that. Is that there's the issue about ethical investment. There's also the issue about divestment. And I think that we can be much more effective focusing in on divestment than ethical investment. We have public pension plans, we have private pension plans, and a lot of them are heavily invested in fossil fuel infrastructure, production, supply, marketing. And for instance, the Canada Pension Plan within SCAN right now, one of our project groups is focusing in on CPP divestment, trying to put some pressure on the Canada Pension Plan, which is heavily invested in fossil fuels, even coal. So I would think, and we've got the teachers' funds and public sector pension funds and private sector pension funds. So I think that if we can start putting some pressure in the pension plans that we belong to, I'm speaking as a senior in that sense, then I think that would be more effective in the longer term than ethical investment funds.
Thank you, David. I agree with you, and our friends over at Shift Action, Adam Scott and Patrick DeRoche, who were on a webinar some weeks back, are working very hard on that, and I encourage those of us who are pensioners, and I think that's pretty well everybody on this screen, to join in. So yeah. One question about the Biden Climate Leaders Summit. Do you think that it will expose the weaknesses or the vulnerabilities of the Canadian climate plan and the whole climate leadership myth propagated by the Justin Trudeau climate leadership myth propagated by the liberal PR machine? Do you think it will make a difference?
I remember Trudeau's quote a number of years ago when he went to an international forum and said, "Canada is back." I guess Biden is now saying the United States is back. And if the United States is back, and when you take a look at the kind of commitments that have been made around the infrastructure funds and green recovery programs, there's some impressive programs and funding that's going on in the States, I think that that has eclipsed Canada. I don't think Trudeau would be going anywhere right now and saying Canada is back. It may be more Canada is at the back of the line when it comes to ambition and programs that will get us to Paris 2030. I'm hoping, you look for small comforts wherever you can find it. In that one chart that we used in the presentation where it said, and future actions that are continued with alignment with the United States. Well, you start hoping, well, maybe United States will introduce real fuel efficiency standards. Maybe they will introduce a real target date for the elimination of internal combustion engines. Maybe they will, but I know that's just hopeful, so I think Canada has to really, as we all do, I guess we have to up the game, but what really worries me too is that it is almost without cost. All of a sudden, we went from 30% to 36% in the blink of an eye. Tomorrow, they could go to Biden and up that to 40%. And it's like, well, what does it mean? What is the reality of climate targets that have no substance behind them?
Well, my thinking is that to avert humiliation, he might be more apt to be flexible. But like you pointed out, we've kind of been down that path before. I see that Kathleen is back on, and that's probably to pull the hook on me. It's 2:14. So I'm going to stop now. There are so many other great questions. Thank you all for submitting them. I just wish we had more time to have this discussion. But one comment was, and it's kind of a question, how can we get your message out to our friends? And I think we're kind of doing this now, but let's give that some thought. Maybe how can we get all of these important messages to our friends? And even those who are not our friends, but think that Canada is doing well on climate, which it is not. So that's my editorial finish, Kathleen.
You're muted, Kathleen.
Okay. I don't want to be a party pooper if everybody wants to stay. I see there's still 91 people. I'm not in any hurry. Should we go with questions another 5 minutes, or what do you think?
I think that'd be a great idea.
If you guys are willing, I'm willing. Just one
Okay.
comment about what Rolly said about the climate summit. I think that down the road, it's not what politicians say. It's the strength of the movements on the ground that are going to hold them accountable, I think, is really what's going to change things. Politicians, it's, their words, but it's what they do that really counts. And I think that that's what's really going to make the difference, is a very powerful on the ground movement, a climate justice movement that really can hold all of the politicians accountable for really putting a climate first policy on the table and then sticking to it.
I think, Terry, though, as you pointed out in your report, you guys were very disappointed in what a lot of the large NGOs actually had to say about the climate plan when it came out, is they weren't anything like as critical as you folks have been, and they clearly hadn't looked at it very carefully, as far as I can tell.
Well, someone once said, when you turn back the thumb screws, after you've been living so long in the wilderness with respect to climate policy, when someone starts to mouth the words that you've been mouthing, you feel relief initially. And my sense is that it's going to take a while for all of us to get, to lift up the rug and to see what's underneath the climate, the PR machine, the federal Liberals have got going, and to take a real look under the hood. What's really here that's going to get us moving toward not only Paris 2030, but it's actually going to do our fair share to reach 1.5.
Well, what we've been trying to do with Time4Action with banks, pension plans, we had Seth Klein on for the good war, like the lack of urgency. Apparently on CBC, you're not even allowed to, the commentators aren't even allowed to say climate emergency.
Yeah,
just insane.
Can't tell it like it is.
No.
And I think Lead Now pointed out that 70% of Canadians think that Trudeau and the Liberals are doing a good job on climate. So we've got a battle ahead of us.
Yeah.
Rolly, have you got any more questions? Oh,
yes, in fact, I'll ask this one here. Great presentation, says Judy Smith, but you didn't mention the cheapest option, which is energy efficiency and energy conservation.
Absolutely.
And she asks why.
Well, yes, I mean, I think that is critical in any climate first policy is energy efficiency, energy conservation. We have to reduce our use of energy. We need both demand side and supply side. Think of the federal budget and think of the Healthy Environment Report. It committed $5,000 to homeowners to engage in energy retrofits. Now, $5,000 is nothing when it comes to deep energy retrofits. All of the estimates out there by groups like Clean Prosperity or Corporate Knights or whoever say you're talking at least 40,000 and up. So our plan right now is for the government is 1 in 10 houses by 2030 will get us some support. The level of support, $5,000, is what it was 17 years ago when a similar program was in place. They haven't even updated the numbers. Then they turn around, and I think it's quite cynical. They turn around and in this budget and say to people, we'll lend you $40,000 interest-free if you do deep energy retrofits of your homes. Now, the reality, the first half of the budget is spent about how hard it is for people, how hard hit we are because of COVID, the need for emergency assistance, the need for emergency benefits, the need for paid sick time, the need for all of the supports we need. And then they turn around and say, oh, but you can go out and borrow $40,000 and retrofit your home. If they were serious about energy efficiency, they would actually have funded the program much higher than 5,000. That would have done something with building emissions. What it is now won't do a thing.
Kathleen, I'm doing
very
a
little.
reservation. I think you need to mute yourself.
Oh,
I have another question, if I may, Kathleen. And the question is from Erica Walker, and she's asking, how to get this presentation on traditional media? Have you given any thought to reaching out to traditional media? And that warrants probably a fairly long discussion, because I've always wondered how we can get our message.
What we've done is we've targeted some specific people who write on the climate file and sent the analysis to them. And ask them to have a look and to consider, putting that kind of perspective into the writing that they do, and in an effort to be more critical and to lift the hood, so to speak, on the Liberal climate plan. I got to admit, there's been not much take up on that so far, but we're hopeful, and maybe because of situations like this where we get the analysis out there and more circulating more, that there'll be more interest that are going to be paid by the traditional media, hopefully.
But I mean, there is other media. We were really encouraged to see that the Energy Mix profiled the report this week. And that was a great story, and that gets out. So, and hopefully other journalists and in more established media see that and say, oh, something's going on. Maybe we should start paying attention to it. It's always a challenge, we know from that, to try to get the attention of the media.
It is indeed. One last question, perhaps, if I could, Kathleen, and this one has to do with the possibility of the NDP and the Greens uniting. So what are your thoughts on 350.org and their suggestion for the Greens and the NDP to unite in the event of an election? That's probably a very political question, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that.
I think, regardless of how useful or important or desirable it is for that to happen, the political parties are just, it's their DNA is almost prevents that from going on. And I speak, I mean, both Terry and I spent a number of years as researchers at the NDP at Queen's Park in Toronto. The notion of the party, you know, vacating a spot to allow the other party to win is, you know, it's like hemlock. It's like hemlock to them. I think that by pushing that idea, I think 350.org is doing an important, well, it's important work, because I think it also then gets into a discussion about, well, what is our voting system anyway? What is our electoral system anyway, that we have to start thinking like this? Why don't we have proportional representation where every vote counts? It's trying to do something that in the face of a first past the post electoral system, which means that, well, look at Ontario. Sorry to speak about Ontario, but Ontario, where, you know, the government got, you know, less than a majority of vote and has a clear majority to do whatever they want, and ignore the, you know, the climate. So I think that it's an important initiative to get the discussion going. That my sense of the parties is that, you know, that it's just such a reach.
I agree with that, but I also think that what this is an opportunity for the climate justice movement to put together what would look like a climate justice platform, and to advocate for that platform across the progressive political parties, and try to hold those progressive political parties accountable to that kind of a real serious climate first strategy. And I think that's probably the only thing the climate justice movement can do at the moment in terms of dealing with retail politics or electoral politics. But I do think that there's work that needs to be done in every political party, because I don't think that they're where they need to be in terms of support for things like carbon budgets, and for getting really, really, really hard on questions of how we're going to phase out the fossil fuel sector entirely. We got to put deadlines on that. We got to put caps for when that's going to occur, and then we got to figure out how we're going to transition to renewables. You know, they're not a big enough mix in the energy mix now, and with the current policies in place, we're not going to get there. And so I think that the climate justice movement needs to do some real hard thinking about how we're going to relate to electoral politics. Does it mean, for example, that we're going to push strategic voting, or are we going to push climate first platforms and try to hold all the political parties, the progressive ones, accountable to that? It's a problem, but David's right. I think one of the major impediments to climate action is our first past the post system. It's a major barrier, and you know, it's a tough nut to crack.
Elizabeth May on one of her webinars said that the first thing we have to do is to educate politicians about climate science. And I will end with that, and back to you, Kathleen. And thank you very much, Terry and David, and I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. Thank you.
Kathleen,
Thanks, Rolly.
Kathleen, I'm going to try and share the screen, but I'm not. The Zoom is on my back today, so if I can't get it, you may have to just describe it. Maybe I'll try.
Okay. As everyone knows, we called it our webinars Time for Action because we want to have people act. We don't just want to chat about things, especially when they're so dire. So after our wonderful guests have spoken and really enlightened us all, Ken is going to try to put up the phone numbers, email addresses, and of Trudeau, Chrystia Freeland, Wilkinson, McKenna, and Seamus O'Regan, because they need to hear from us. You can't do it?
Someone already put them up in the chat about 10 minutes ago. And
Okay.
Zoom is telling me I'm unable to start the video because the host has stopped it, but I'm the host. So
Okay, so
well then.
So Ken, can you put up the poster for next week, or should I just read about it?
That's the whole point. I can't put anything up.
Okay. I thought that was going to be the answer. So anyway, my point is we should really try to contact our that's not it. That's the one you wanted before.
How about that?
That's it. Great.
Okay.
Okay, so next week, we're going to have, as you can see, Tim Ellis from Lead Now and Dale Marshall from Environmental Defense to sum up the Earth Summit, which starts tomorrow on Earth Day and goes for 2 days. 40 world leaders are expected to attend. The summit is designed to encourage countries to make stronger commitments, as we heard earlier about the nationally determined contributions. That was what every country had to make during Paris, and they're all supposed to make new ones. Canada hasn't done it yet. The European Union and the UK have. The US is probably going to do it during the summit. So it'll be interesting to watch what, as we were saying earlier, what Canada does during the summit, how much we get pushed to sound better. So I hope you can join us. By the way, we're going to have a webinar on May 5th. We're going to talk about the Climate Emergency Alliance being pushed by 350.org. We'll have someone from 350 and someone from Fair Vote Canada talking about this very thing. And we're hoping to look at small, I call them nuclear reactors. I think modular sounds too simple, too safe. Small nuclear reactors, because I heard Gordon Edwards this morning talking, and it's just horrendous. We have millions of tons, hundreds of millions of tons of radioactive waste already that we don't know what to do with. So anyway, all of that is in the future. And of course, as we said, Martin Lukash will be on May 12th, talking about the Trudeau formula and what really is behind sunny ways. As we found out today, dark days. So thank you again to our guests and to the viewers, and back to you, Ken.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'd just like to thank everyone who joined us for this webinar. I don't think anyone could come away having not learned a tremendous amount of very disconcerting information today. I think I'd like to really personally thank David and Terry, not only for being here today, but I think they've done something that's just profound, because it simply was missing. I was looking and trying to read this plan, and I just couldn't wrap my head around what is going on here. And it's just so concerning. And I love, David and Terry, the way you framed it, that you're seniors who are trying to support the juniors, i.e. the young people, because the young people need exactly this kind of analysis. They have the passion, but they don't have the understanding of this, I don't think. Certainly, most of us don't. It's just so disappointing to see that the Liberals are so far away from what needs to be done. They're just so captured. It's just, we need some liberal carbon decapture or something. I don't know what it is. Anyway, we better end the session there. Thank you again so much, Terry and David, and all the people who put in questions and listened right through to here. We still have 70 people on board. And hopefully we'll see you next week.